At 7:30 on April 15, 1945, Private First Class Harold Gonzalez pressed himself flat against a jagged slab of volcanic rock on the lower slopes of Mount Yayatake, Okinawa. Japanese mortar rounds were already walking across the hillside above him. Short, sharp detonations bursting in tight clusters where American forward observers had tried to direct artillery fire only minutes earlier. Gonzalez was 19 years old. He had been on Okinawa 14 days. He had yet to complete a single mission without casualties. Above him, the mountain loomed like a fortress. Colonel Udo's Japanese force, nearly 1,500 men, had transformed Mount Yayatake into a layered defensive system. Interconnected caves, spider holes, camouflaged bunkers, and firing ports cut directly into volcanic stone. Former 25mm anti-aircraft guns had been dragged into direct fire positions, their barrels now leveled at marine infantry instead of aircraft. Whoever controlled Yayatake controlled the entire Moto Peninsula, and whoever failed to take it paid in blood. The 6th Marine Division had been grinding uphill for 4 days. Progress was measured in yards. Casualties were measured in dozens. Gonzalez belonged to an 8-man forward observer team from Battery L, 4th Battalion, 15th Marines. Their tasks sounded simple on paper and lethal in reality. Get close enough to see enemy positions. Transmit coordinates back to the 105mm howitzers positioned 3 miles behind the lines. Adjust fire. Repeat. But Mount Yayatake refused to cooperate. The Japanese had buried their defenses deep into the mountain's natural cave system. Artillery rounds that would obliterate surface targets slammed into rock and collapsed empty tunnels, doing little damage to the actual firing ports. If artillery was going to work, forward observers needed eyes on the exact positions, the real machine gun embrasures, mortar pits, and reverse slopes where Japanese infantry assembled before counterattacking. That meant getting within 200 yards of the enemy, sometimes closer. The numbers were unforgiving. In the first 3 days of the assault, 7 forward observer teams had attempted to push onto the forward slopes. 5 were driven back by concentrated fire. 2 succeeded in calling fire. Both took casualties. One lost its radio operator to a sniper. Another lost its officer when a mortar detonated 15 feet from their position. Gonzalez listened to the radio traffic constantly. Observers calling adjustments, batteries responding, corrections being issued, and then silence. Seconds later, unfamiliar voices appeared on the same frequency. The guns were not the problem. The 105mm howitzers were accurate enough. Gonzalez knew that. He trained on both 75 and 105mm guns at Camp Pendleton. He understood ballistics. He understood that without precise observation, artillery was just expensive noise. The problem was survival. Gonzalez had volunteered for forward observer duty back in November 1944 when the 6th Marine Division was forming on Guadalcanal. He had already fought with the 22nd Marines through the Marshall Islands, Eniwetok, and the liberation of Guam. Enough combat to understand a simple truth. Forward observation got men killed. But without it, infantry died instead. That morning, his commanding officer had called for volunteers. A new observation post was needed, one with a direct line of sight to the eastern approach of Yayatake. Radios were unreliable in the broken terrain, so the team would run field telephone wire all the way back to battalion command. 3 men, 1 officer, 2 enlisted Marines. Wire, binoculars, maps. No radio. No backup. If the wire was cut, they were blind. If they were discovered, they were on their own. The plan was brutally simple. Move during a scheduled artillery barrage. Advance uphill while the Japanese were forced underground. String wire as they moved. Dig in. Call fire. The briefing didn't mention the 11 observers wounded or killed in similar attempts over the previous 72 hours. It didn't need to. At 7:55, American artillery opened fire. 105mm shells screamed overhead, hammering the mountain in rolling thunder. The officer gave the signal, and 3 Marines broke from cover, climbing into smoke, flying rock fragments, and terrain that had already devoured better-equipped teams. Gonzalez moved in a crouch, one hand gripping a spool of telephone wire, the other steadying himself against loose volcanic scree. 20 yards ahead, the officer navigated between fresh craters. Behind Gonzalez, the 3rd Marine fed out a second wire line, redundancy, in case shrapnel severed one. The theory was sound. The reality was merciless. At 8:12, the artillery lifted. The silence was worse. Gonzalez could hear his own breathing. Loose stones sliding downhill. Wire unspooling with a soft mechanical whisper. The observation point, a shallow natural depression, lay roughly 230 yards upslope. From there, they could see a network of machine gun nests, mortar pits, and what intelligence suggested was a cave large enough to conceal an infantry company. The maps were 4 days old. On Okinawa, 4 days was an eternity. The slope steepened. The wire snagged on shattered trees and jagged rock. Gonzalez freed it without stopping. At 8:27, a single rifle shot cracked across the hillside. The round struck stone 10 feet to the officer's left and ricocheted with a sharp whine. The officer dropped flat. Gonzalez hit the ground half a second later. No follow-up. A ranging shot, or a warning. Either way, the Japanese had seen them. The officer signaled, "Move, faster now." The window was closing. Gonzalez rose into a low run. The wire spool grew lighter in his hand as lines spilled behind him. 50 yards. 40. At 8:33, Japanese mortars opened up. Not artillery, infantry mortars. Mobile. Accurate. Built for killing men in exactly this terrain. The first round landed 40 yards behind them. The second hit 30 yards to their right. The mountain had found them, and the mission was only just beginning. The third mortar round landed 20 yards ahead and 15 yards left. The Japanese crews were no longer guessing. They were walking the fire, searching, adjusting, tightening the bracket. Gonzalez understood the pattern instantly. Indirect fire followed rules. Once mortars began bracketing, it meant the crews had range. 3 more rounds, maybe 4, and the depression they were running toward would disappear in a blast of rock and steel. The officer reached the observation point first and dove headlong into the shallow hollow. Gonzalez followed 5 seconds later, landing hard, rolling instinctively, coming up already checking the wire spool. Still intact, still feeding. The third Marine slid into the depression just as a mortar round detonated exactly where they had been standing 8 seconds earlier. Fragments ripped through the air above them. The concussion hit like a physical blow. Gonzalez's ears rang. His vision blurred for a heartbeat. He blinked dirt from his eyes and raised his binoculars, forcing himself to focus on the terrain ahead. What he saw tightened his stomach. The Japanese positions were closer than the maps had indicated. Much closer. Close enough to see individual soldiers moving between firing ports. Close enough that when they opened fire, there would be nowhere to hide. The main defensive line ran along a natural ridgeline 160 yards straight ahead. Through drifting smoke, Gonzalez counted. 7 rifle pits connected by communication trenches. 3 machine gun positions with overlapping fields of fire. 2 mortar pits set back behind the forward line. All camouflaged with netting and vegetation. Nearly invisible from the air, but unmistakable from their angle. The positions covered every approach to the summit. Any Marine infantry assaulting this slope would walk directly into a kill zone with no cover and no margin for error, which was exactly why they were here. The officer was already connecting the telephone wire to the field phone, hands steady despite the continuing impacts across the hillside. Gonzalez unfolded his map and began marking positions, range, bearing, estimated strength. The phone crackled to life. The officer cranked the handle and established contact with the battalion fire direction center. His voice remained calm, precise, professional as he read off coordinates and requested high explosive fire, adjusting for elevation and wind. The response came back immediately. Time to first rounds, 90 seconds. Gonzalez raised his binoculars and watched the ridge, counting. At 95 seconds, he heard it. The rising shriek of incoming American artillery. The first salvo landed 200 yards beyond the target. Long, the officer called. Down 200. Repeat. The second salvo landed 30 yards short. Dirt and rock geysered into the air, but the Japanese positions held. They had dug deep. Overhead cover reinforced with logs, sandbags, scavenged materials. The officer adjusted again. Up 30. Left 20. Fire for effect. The third salvo walked directly across the ridgeline. Through his binoculars, Gonzalez watched one machine gun position take a direct hit. The blast tore through the overhead cover and collapsed the emplacement. Another round detonated inside a communication trench between rifle pits. Effective, but not enough. As artillery suppressed the forward line, Japanese infantry emerged from previously hidden spider holes along the flanks, positions not marked on any map. Rifle fire snapped into the depression. The sharp crack of Arisaka rifles mixed with the heavier thump of Nambu machine guns. The Japanese had identified them as forward observers. They became the priority target. The officer kept calling adjustments. Shift right 50. New target. Suspected assembly area. Fire 3 rounds. The telephone wire stretched across open ground behind them. Vulnerable, exposed. One piece of shrapnel could sever it and blind them completely. At 8:52, a Japanese grenade landed 15 feet away. It detonated instantly. Rock fragments slammed into the depression. Gonzalez felt a hot line slice across his left forearm. He glanced down, bleeding, but shallow. He ignored it. The officer called another mission. Shells crashed into the suspected assembly area. Secondary explosions rippled through the smoke. Ammunition or a mortar pit, possibly both. The Japanese response intensified. More grenades. More rifle fire. A sustained burst from a Nambu machine gun chewed through rock 2 feet above Gonzalez's head, forcing him flat against the bottom of the hollow. The third Marine had taken shrapnel across the shoulder, bleeding heavily, but still functional. The officer made a decision. They had to move closer. From this position, they could see the forward defenses, but not the reverse slopes, not the cave entrances, not the reserve staging areas feeding the fight. Without that information, the upcoming infantry assault would go in blind. The infantry was scheduled to attack in 4 hours. The math was brutal. Risk 3 lives now, or risk hundreds later. At 9:03, the officer gave the signal. They would advance another 100 yards. He would go first. Gonzalez would follow with the wire. The third Marine would provide covering fire, then move once the first 2 were set. Textbook fire and movement. Except textbooks assumed suppressive fire. Assumed smoke. Assumed the enemy wasn't already tracking you through rifle sights from 120 yards away. The officer rolled out of the depression and sprinted uphill. Japanese fire erupted instantly. Rounds cracked past him, kicked dirt at his feet. He covered 20 yards and dove behind a cluster of rocks barely large enough to hide a man. He signaled. Clear. Move. Gonzalez grabbed the wire spool and broke cover. The first steps were the worst. Every instinct screamed to stay down. But staying down meant moving slow, and slow meant dying. He ran uphill in a crouched sprint, half-controlled fall over loose rock. A Nambu machine gun opened up from the ridgeline. The crew had anticipated the move. Tracers ripped past him, close enough to disturb the air. The sound was like canvas tearing. 15 yards. 20. The wire unspooled behind him. A thin copper lifeline back to artillery, back to the only force keeping the Japanese from overrunning the sector. At 25 yards, his boot caught on loose rock. He went down hard on his left knee. The wire spool bounced from his hand. For half a second, he was completely exposed, motionless, no cover, rifle fire converging. Training took over. He snatched the spool, surged forward, covered the last 10 yards in 4 steps, and threw himself behind the rocks beside the officer. The impact drove the air from his lungs. But the wire was still intact, and they were still in the fight. Gonzalez gasped, rolled onto his side, and checked the wire. Still intact. Still connected. The officer was already scanning uphill, eyes moving fast, calculating. Another 50 yards, he said quietly. Another sprint across open ground. Another cluster of volcanic rock. Another movement observed by enemy positions that had already proven their accuracy. Behind them, the 3rd Marine broke cover from the original observation point and ran the same gauntlet they had just survived. He made it halfway. A Japanese grenade landed directly in his path. The explosion caught him in the open. Shrapnel ripped through his utilities and threw him sideways. He hit the ground hard and didn't move. 1 second. 2. 3. At 4 seconds, he pushed himself up and staggered forward, half running, half falling, until he collapsed behind the rocks beside them. Blood soaked his shoulder and streamed from both legs. Not fatal. Not yet. Enough blood loss to make the next movement dangerous. The officer applied field dressings with mechanical efficiency, hands steady, movements practiced. Gonzalez strung the wire forward, preparing for the next push. They had advanced 70 yards from their starting position, 70 yards closer to Japanese lines, 70 yards deeper into a kill zone growing tighter with every step. The final observation point would put them within 80 yards of enemy positions, close enough to identify individual soldiers, close enough to call artillery with devastating precision, close enough that grenades could reach them easily, close enough that rifle fire would be point-blank. And if they were pinned there, extraction would be impossible. At 9:17, American artillery shifted fire to the reverse slope where intelligence suggested Japanese reserves were staging. Good fire. Effective suppression. But it also meant the forward positions were no longer under artillery pressure, which meant Japanese infantry would move. Gonzalez watched the ridgeline through his binoculars. He saw soldiers emerging from spider holes, moving deliberately, repositioning. He counted heads. 12, 15, 20. They were moving toward positions with direct line of sight to the route the Marines would have to cross for the final approach. The officer checked his watch. The next artillery barrage was scheduled for 9:30, 13 minutes away. They could wait and move during the barrage, or they could move now, while the Japanese were still reacting rather than anticipating. The officer chose now. He signaled the 3rd Marine to stay where he was, provide what covering fire he could. Then he looked at Gonzalez. Final position. Final sprint. 80 yards from enemy lines. The officer went first at 9:19. He sprinted low across broken ground toward a shallow ravine, the only covered approach to the final observation point. Japanese rifle fire tracked him instantly. Round snapped past, struck rock. He covered 30 yards before diving behind a dead tree trunk that barely qualified as concealment. He signaled. Gonzalez followed 10 seconds later. The wire spool was nearly empty, maybe 50 feet left. Barely enough. He ran hunched forward, body angled with the slope. The Nambu machine gun opened up again, sustained fire. The gun crew had his range. A round tugged at his utility jacket. Another kicked dirt across his boots. He reached the dead tree trunk and dropped beside the officer, chest heaving. The wire spool showed 15 feet remaining. Not enough. They needed more line. The 3rd Marine understood without being told. He grabbed his own wire spool and began crawling forward, slow, exposed, bleeding from 3 wounds. Japanese riflemen spotted him immediately. Rounds tore into the ground around his body. He kept crawling. 10 yards. 15. A mortar round detonated 20 feet to his left, rolling him sideways. He lay still for 5 seconds, then resumed crawling. He reached the tree trunk, handed over the wire spool, and collapsed. The officer spliced the lines together quickly, tested the connection. Solid. He signaled Gonzalez. Final movement. 40 yards to the ravine. They moved together at 9:24. The officer carried the field telephone. Gonzalez fed wire from both spools. Japanese fire intensified, not random shots now, but coordinated volleys. The defenders had identified the ravine as the objective and prepared fields of fire to deny it. The officer reached the ravine entrance first and turned, firing his carbine to cover the approach. Gonzalez sprinted the last 15 yards as rifle rounds cracked past his head, tumbled into the ravine, and landed hard on jagged rock. Both wire spools clattered beside him, still feeding, still intact. The ravine was 8 feet deep and 30 feet long, its walls nearly vertical volcanic rock. The floor was littered with shrapnel and spent casings from previous fights. At the far end, a natural ledge provided a perfect observation step. The officer set up the field telephone. Gonzalez moved to the ledge. From here, he could see everything. Machine gun positions, mortar pits, communication trenches, cave entrances where supplies moved, assembly areas where fresh troops gathered, a target-rich environment. Every coordinate he called would save lives. The phone crackled. Connection established. Gonzalez began calling targets. The officer relayed. Artillery answered. Shells walked across the Japanese defensive network. Adjustments, corrections, precise destruction. This was what forward observation was meant to be. At 9:41, Japanese soldiers began emerging from cave entrances, not retreating, advancing. They moved in small groups, staying low, using terrain. They were coming for the ravine. Gonzalez counted. 12 from the left, 8 from the right. More beyond his field of view. Standard counter-recon doctrine. Kill the observers. Blind the artillery. The 3rd Marine crawled to the ravine entrance, bleeding heavily, still conscious, rifle ready. 3 Marines. 1 ravine. The artillery barrage would last 8 more minutes. Either artillery broke the assault, or the infantry reached them first. At 9:43, the first Japanese soldiers reached grenade range. Gonzalez saw grenades arc through the air. The 3rd Marine opened fire with his M1 Garand, controlled shots. 2 Japanese soldiers fell. The grenades landed short, detonating 15 yards from the ravine. Fragments whined overhead. No casualties. But the distance was closing, and the next grenades would be closer. The Japanese infantry adjusted immediately. They stopped advancing in straight lines and began using the broken terrain, sliding between rocks, dropping into shell craters, advancing in bounds while others provided covering fire. It was textbook infantry movement, disciplined and deliberate. The officer never stopped calling fire. His voice stayed level as rifle rounds cracked past the ravine entrance. Machine gun position, bearing 270. Gonzalez fed him numbers. Mortar pit, bearing 315. The wire vibrated as transmissions went out. Suspected ammunition cache, bearing 295. The artillery batteries answered. Shells walked across the ridge with growing precision. Then the suspected ammunition cache detonated. Not a single impact, but a massive secondary explosion that sent debris and flame high into the air. That wasn't just a pit. That was a supply dump. Japanese soldiers scattered as follow-up rounds bracketed the blast zone. The effect was devastating, 24 casualties at least. A critical node in the defensive network gone. But the infantry moving on the ravine kept coming. They had orders. The observers had to die. At 9:51, Japanese soldiers reached positions within 50 yards. Close enough to see faces. Close enough to see hands pulling grenade pins. The 3rd Marine fired steadily. 8-round clips. Reload. Fire. Reload. Despite blood loss, his shooting stayed controlled. 3 more Japanese soldiers fell. The advance paused, but only briefly. The officer made another calculation. The ravine gave excellent observation of the reverse slope, but the forward fighting line was still partially masked by terrain. That was where the Marine infantry would hit first. That was where casualties would be heaviest unless artillery could suppress those positions in advance. Suppressing them required closer observation. Closer than the ravine. Closer meant moving into a zone where artillery could no longer support them without risking friendly fire. It meant suicide by any reasonable standard. But the math hadn't changed. 3 lives versus 300. At 9:58, the American artillery barrage paused for barrel cooling. Silence fell across the hillside. The Japanese surged forward. 50 yards became 40. 40 became 30. The 3rd Marine's rifle went empty. He reached for another clip and fumbled it, blood loss stealing his coordination. He forced it into the rifle and fired. The shot went wide. His hands were shaking. The officer spoke into the field telephone. Final fire mission. Danger close. He read off grid coordinates that would put American shells within 100 yards of their own position. The fire direction center hesitated. Requested confirmation. The officer repeated the coordinates. Insisted. At 10:04, American shells began landing. Not on the reverse slope, but on the approaches to the ravine itself. The blast caught the Japanese infantry in the open. The concussion rolled through the ravine. Gonzalez felt pressure slam into his chest, felt his teeth rattle. When the barrage lifted, the slope was littered with bodies. The survivors withdrew to cover. The immediate threat was gone. But the forward Japanese fighting line, the real kill zone, remained intact. Untouched. Waiting. The officer looked at Gonzalez. Looked at the 3rd Marine, barely able to hold his rifle. Then looked uphill, and made the decision every forward observer eventually faced. He pointed forward. They left the ravine at 10:09. The officer led with the field telephone and binoculars. Gonzalez followed with the wire spool. The 3rd Marine stayed behind, too weak to move, but kept the line open and covered their rear. The gap between American and Japanese lines was 78 yards. No man's land. They advanced in short rushes, 10 yards at a time, dropping into shell craters, moving again. The wire paid out behind them. A thin copper lifeline across 400 yards of contested ground. At 10:15, they reached the remains of a Japanese outpost. Now a crater 15 feet across, and 8 feet deep. 40 yards from the main fighting line. Close enough to hear voices. Close enough that grenades mattered more than rifles. The officer connected the phone. The line was still clear. Gonzalez raised his binoculars. From here, nothing was hidden. Machine gun bunker, bearing 090, he said. Reinforced overhead cover. Active. Mortar position, bearing 120. 2 tubes. Ammunition stacked. Then, command post, bearing 155. Radio antenna. Heavy traffic. Possibly Colonel Udo's forward headquarters. A high-value target. The officer passed the coordinates. Artillery acknowledged. 2 minutes to impact. At 10:19, shells walked across the reverse slope with lethal precision. Direct hit on the mortar position. The ammunition detonated. Secondary explosions rolled outward. The blast wave reached the crater and rained debris down on them. Adjust fire. Right 30. The machine gun bunker. The third round punched through overhead cover. The bunker collapsed. The gun went silent. The Japanese defenders understood now. Forward observers were inside their perimeter. Every position was exposed. And every second they stayed alive, more of the mountain was dying. The Japanese were no longer trying to hold their positions. They were advancing. Not retreating under artillery fire, not dispersing into caves, but moving directly toward the crater where 2 Marines were methodically dismantling their defensive network, one fire mission at a time. Rifle fire intensified. Rounds snapped over the crater rim and smashed into the volcanic rock, forcing Gonzalez and the officer flat against the ground. A grenade arced overhead and landed 10 feet from the crater. It detonated, fragments shrieking past their helmets. Another grenade followed, closer this time. 5 feet. Dirt and stone rained down on them. The officer never stopped calling fire. Gonzalez never stopped spotting. Another ammunition cache vanished in a secondary explosion. Another fighting position collapsed. Japanese soldiers abandoned prepared defenses that had taken weeks to build. The artillery was doing exactly what forward observation existed to make possible. But the infantry kept coming, using shell holes, using dead ground, moving between impacts with discipline and intent. Gonzalez counted them through his binoculars. 8 advancing from the left, 6 from the right, more emerging from positions he couldn't fully track, all converging on the crater. At 10:27, a Japanese soldier reached close range. Grenade range. The throw was precise. The grenade landed inside the crater, 3 feet from Gonzalez, 3 feet from the officer, 3 feet from the field telephone that connected them to the artillery batteries. Gonzalez saw the grenade, saw the fuse burning, saw the officer hesitate for half a second, not from fear, but calculation. 3 feet was too far to throw it clear, too close to escape the blast. No time, only a choice. Harold Gonzalez was 19 years old. He had survived the Gilberts, Perry Island, Guam, and 14 days on Okinawa. He understood artillery. He understood probabilities. He understood that some calculations ended with only one possible answer. He moved. Harold Gonzalez threw himself forward and covered the grenade with his body. The explosion killed him instantly. The blast that would have torn 2 Marines apart was absorbed by him instead. The officer survived. The field telephone survived. The wire connection to the artillery batteries survived. The officer grabbed the handset, ears ringing, body shaking, and called in the final coordinates, targeting the command post Gonzalez had identified minutes earlier. The artillery answered. 3 salvos. Direct hits. The command post collapsed. Colonel Udo's forward headquarters ceased to exist. Defensive coordination across the entire northern sector broke down. Japanese infantry reached the crater less than a minute later and found 1 Marine dead and 1 Marine still transmitting. They opened fire. The officer was hit twice and went down. The telephone went silent. But the mission was already complete. Every major Japanese position on the eastern approach to Mount Yayatake had been identified, mapped, and targeted. The artillery had everything it needed. At 1300 hours, Marine infantry began the assault. They met resistance, machine guns, mortars, rifles, but the positions that should have annihilated them had been shattered. Mortar pits were gone. Bunkers collapsed. Ammunition caches detonated. The observers had gotten close enough. They had stayed alive long enough. The Marines reached the summit of Mount Yayatake on April 18, 1945. 700 Japanese soldiers were killed. The stronghold anchoring the Moto Peninsula defense was broken. The northern approaches to the Okinawa beaches were secured. Harold Gonzalez did not live to see it. His body was recovered from the crater on April 16, 19 years old. Forward observer. Battery L, 4th Battalion, 15th Marines. Killed in action performing the mission. Artillery depends on, and infantry survives because of. The officer survived his wounds, returned to duty 6 weeks later, and personally submitted the Medal of Honor recommendation. President Harry S. Truman signed the citation on June 19, 1946. The medal was presented to Gonzalez's sister, Marie, in San Francisco. The citation used words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. They were accurate. They were insufficient. What happened took 3 seconds on a volcanic slope in Okinawa, when a 19-year-old Marine saw a grenade and moved toward it instead of away. Harold Gonzalez was the only Hispanic Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in World War II. His name appears on monuments. Facilities bore his name. His photograph hung in the Pentagon. But the real monument was built on April 15, 1945. Built by a forward observer who volunteered for a mission with almost no chance of survival. Who pushed farther forward than any team had survived. Who called fire that saved hundreds of Marines he would never meet. The mathematics were simple. 3 lives or 2. Mission or self. Harold Gonzalez made the calculation and paid the price.